Welcome back, MTG Joe here. Today we are going to be looking at the weekly metagame breakdown, looking at the top performing decks on the MTG Arena ladder. This video's focus is going to be on traditional standard best of three, so we're going to be covering the best decks in the format. We're going to be getting the data from Untapped.gg, what you see on the screen, companion tool that tracks arena win rates, gives all these cool stats. If you want to use Untapped, video description down below. If you want the deck list to copy paste, video description down below. While you're down there, make sure to hit that like button on the video, help support the channel. But let's jump into it. We're going to start with popularity of the day, kind of the metagame distribution, and then we'll look at the individual deck stats themselves. So Diamond Mythic rank for the day in terms of popularity, Dimir Midrange at about 13%, the Esper Bounce Pixie list at about 10, Gruul Prowess at about 10, Zur Domain at about 8. We have Golgari Midrange in the 4s, Mono Red dropped off quite a bit, kind of replaced by the Gruul Prowess deck in terms of win rate. Gruul Delirium at 4% and Selesnya counters at 4%. The Golgari decks we're not going to cover today. They're all doing pretty poor. So that one there kind of dropped off. Simic Terror sub 50%. So something that we're not covering today as well. So just kind of keeping in mind. But looking, Diamond Mythic rank, 37,000 games played from the 17th through to the 24th in Diamond Mythic rank. Highest win rate deck of the week is Azorius Oculus. So when everybody's making you discard cards, why don't you just reanimate them instead? So Helping Hand and Recommission, that helps you get out Adherent Oculus or Hadi Jin, kind of cheating it out that way. A lot of ways to put cards into your graveyard, Chart of Course, Moment of Truth, Picklock Prankster, Founding Mills, and it kind of enables all within one. We see Split Up in the main, Soul Partition, and Unsummon as some of these spells. This particular deck is just playing Thundering Falls as an additional Surveil land. Get you that turn 1 Surveil and Oculus like a champ. In your sideboard, if your opponent is going heavy in terms of graveyard hate, you swap out some of your threats to Monastery Mentor that doesn't care about your graveyard. Split Up is more sweepers for the aggressive creature decks. Negate for the big mana decks like Zur. Destroy Evil, again, big mana decks. Enchantment decks, stuff like that. Graveyard Hate for any deck that's using kind of the mirror, and then Elspeth Spite as more cheap removal. This was actually the third highest in terms of next deck, but wanted to kind of highlight there's a Jeskai Oculus version as well. So similar ideas, but you're using your Oculus. You have one Kiora, Steam Core Scholar as another way with drawing cards. So a lot more creature dense. The graveyard is kind of a secondary condition. So you can kind of just play a fair game. You're not all in on the graveyard type effect. FOMO can get you extra combat steps. Malkin draws discards. Inti gets you advantage when you're trying to discard. Highway Robberies, kind of like a Faithless Looting style effect. Scorching Dragonfire, Torch Tower, Siren. So a little bit more creature dense, a little bit more interactive, but you are playing a little bit potentially more painful or come into play tapped in terms of your mana base. Sideboard gives you Forge for the heavy kind of removal matchups. Ido, again, for just, you have kind of like a grind package. Against like the bounce deck, I found Case of the Crimson Pulse quite effective. Similarly against the aggressive decks. For the mono red decks, Gruul Prowess, you have Sheltered by Ghosts as removal and lifelink. No More Lies is a cheap counter in kind of the mid-range to control-ish matchups. Get Lost, flexible removal, Exercise, really good against Zur, big mana decks, stuff like that. And then a Ghost Vacuum for graveyard hate. We then go to Gruul Prowess, 74%. So this is kind of the adaptation of a lot of the mono red decks that they're shifting to. Having access to the Innkeeper's Talon is just a recurable way to get Valiant triggers. It lets your small creatures kind of scale up. Questing Druid is card advantage as well in the main board. This version's on one Paw Patch Recruit. You sometimes see two, one Snakeskin Veil, and then Obliterating Bolt in the main with your traditional kind of mono red package. Split of 3-2 between Torch Tower and Burst Lightning. You'll also see in the mana base a Soulstone Sanctuary. This is a mouse if you squint hard enough, so it plays with the kind of manifold mouse package in the deck. Sideboard, Sentinel of the Nameless City, just lets you kind of scale up a bit if they're bringing in like temporary lockdowns. Kind of the creature mirrors lets you go offense defense, which plays a little nice. Against Split Up, gives you some optionality where you can keep pressuring, and it can provide some card advantage via the map tokens. Scorching Shot is removal, Questing Druid for grind, Pyroclasm for kind of the go wide decks. Interesting because you can kind of scale up into like bigger Gruul. Good against like green-white tokens, counters style deck. Paw Patch, Enchantment Hate, Flyer Hate, in a pinch draws you a card. Torch, cheap removal, Lithomantic Barrage for the Oculus decks, the Terror decks, stuff like that. And then Paw Patch against Dimir, Esper, anything that's targeting a lot of your creatures. We then go to Zur Domain, 72% on this one here. So this list here, we see Temporary Lockdown, an effective card against the Pixie deck. Now, mind you, they do have this town, so they can bounce it and get all those ETB effects. So just be mindful with that. It's not a clean answer. Drawing cards off up the beanstalk with all the overlords in this deck. Elspeth Smite, get lost, just a little bit more cheap interaction. 3 Sunfalls kind of mixed into there, but the goal of the deck, you get these overlords out, they draw you cards off up the beanstalks, and then you animate them with Zur for lifelink and immediate kind of attacking value. Nissa is really good into the mono white matchups. They like the token decks, the mirrors, just being able to be repeatable artifact and enchantment hate. Beza for the aggressive or mid-range decks, Temporary Lockdown for the aggressive decks, Rest in Peace for graveyard hate, Paw Patch, enchantment, flyer hate. Not on My Watch is another cheaper for the aggressive matchups, Negate for the mid-range to control decks, and then Doppelgang comes in for the mid-range mirrors, Zur Domain mirrors, just copy stuff. When the games are going long, just lets you be the bigger deck and go over the top. Moving on, we go to Dimir Midrange. So Midrange, not Bounce. The Midrange version was doing better than Bounce this week. So we see Feybloom Trick, just a way to get multiple bodies, tap something down, 1 Preacher. The multiple bodies can draw you multiple cards off Enduring Curiosity. You have kind of the Fairy package with a couple counter spells, Mastermind in here, Flood Pit's Drowner, Anoint, just a whole bunch of cheap removal mixed in. Now notably, this version doesn't have Nowhere to Run in the main, so the hexproof style effects can be still relevant. Some Soul Stones and Restless Reef, but this deck's quite a pain on the draw, like Kaido on play, like on curve on turn 3 is very hard to deal with for most decks. Ix Command is a sweeper, Shieldred for the mid-range decks. Honestly, even like the aggressive decks, like against Gruul Red, they can have a hard time dealing with this. If you untap with it, you could usually run away with the game, just gaining a bunch of life. Tashana for activated abilities, triggered abilities, stuff like that. So like Leyline Binding's really good. The Overlords triggers, stuff of that nature. Preacher is good against the mid-range matchups, the aggressive decks. A whole bunch of different removal options. Edict, Nowhere to Run, Anoint all in there. Negate for the big mana decks. Ghost Vacuum for graveyard hate, and Duress for the mid-rangey to control style matchups. Moving on, mono white control. So this deck here, tokens, kill everything, but gain a bunch of life. So lay down arms, kill stuff. Get lost, kill stuff. You could draw a ton of cards off Caretakers and Enduring Curiosity. Sweepers and Day Judgment and Sunfall. And then tokens through the Overlord. Tokens through Beza and gain you life. Tokens through Elspeth and gain you life. Tokens and gain life. So just a bunch of ways to make tokens, kind of gum up the board, and then just grind out where every turn you're drawing potentially 1 to 2 extra cards. So you just kind of outvalue your opponent. Redundancy with your mana base as well through like Fountain Port. Stonebrain basically is here for Jace. Jace can mill you out, which is an effective way in the mid-range battles. Against combo decks, if you run into like the Omniscience deck, which didn't show up in the stats this week, but the kind of cheat into play Omniscience deck, which was kind of a flavor of the week. Rest in Peace for graveyard hate, Exercise for kind of the mirrors, enchantment decks, Surge of Salvation for red or black decks, for like damage or like discard. Also Smite for the aggressive decks, along with Authority of the consoles. Boros Mice, so 67% on this one here. So your red base package, you have Emberheart, Manifold, Heartfire, but you also have Mabel in here. And it's got a couple 3-drops in terms of Screaming Nemesis, as well as Urbrass Forge in the main. A couple Lightning Helix, few Sheltered, and Shard Mage as the rest of the white cards. But basically, this mana base needs to improve, play the full set of Inspiring Vantage. You probably want Forge in the side, so like make this a 4 of, make this potentially one of these a 4 of as well, I would say. More Forges for like the grindier matchups. Screaming Nemesis for the red-based aggro decks. Same with Sheltered. Pyroclasm's an interesting one here, where your creatures don't necessarily scale out of it. You could have some creatures like Emberheart or Heartfire, but Pyroclasm is generally a card I bring in against a deck like this. So I guess like for if you run into Convoke or something like that. Knight of Grace is a nice addition against black-based removal decks since it gets hexproof. But I believe Nowhere's to Run's wording gets around hexproof. Creatures, yeah, so the hexproof's not as relevant with Nowhere to Run being so prevalent. Get Lost is cheap removal, so just kind of a whole removal package based on what you're running into creature-wise. Esper Pixie, Esper Self Bounce, 67%. So this deck here is looking to kind of get repeated value out of your enter the battlefield style effects. So Storm Chaser's Talent draws, discards, or sorry, like comes into play, makes you a token. Then you can bounce it to hand. You can get the loops where Storm Chaser's Talent, you then cast this town ain't big enough, get it back, create another token with it when you cast it, level it up, get Storm Chaser, or this town ain't big enough, bounce back to hand, then level it up. So you kind of do those loops. Optimistic Scavenger scales your team in terms of size with all these enchantments. Pixie picks up stuff. Mockingbird could copy like Pixie or Fear of Isolation, get you that extra value. Nightmare over and over to eat away at their hand, and then you can cheat in some Kaidos. Nowhere to Run, go for the throat, just a bunch of removal. This deck's very, like, never seems to run out of gas since you're just recycling cards that are, you know, they come instant play, get some value. Artifact Enchantment Hate with Lauren, Witch's Vanity is some more cheap removal for the aggressive decks. So anything like the Mice package, stuff like that, makes you food and you can bounce it back to hand. Sheltered by Ghosts for the red-based aggro decks. Rest in Peace is Graveyard Hate. Pest Control for the mirrors. So this will hit your stuff as well, so be mindful. You can bring it in for the mirrors, for Convoke, for mono red potentially. No More Lies is cheap counters. Destroy Evils for big mana decks. Hellraiser combo. So this probably is just a player named Nithin. They play this deck religiously. They have hundreds of games with it, but core of this deck is drawing and discarding, filling your graveyard. And what you're trying to do is use Capricious Hellraiser to get copies. So basically you would cast Season of Weaving, make a copy of it, get to go again. Chandra Flamecaller can copy it, and then you kind of Splinter Twin it, make a whole bunch of creatures, pop Bitter Reunion, give them all haste. You can, a bunch of removal in the deck, Torch Tower, Unsummon, Ill-Time Explosion as a sweeper, Fires of Victory as some more removal, the Elder Dragon War as a permanent that can also be used. You have the Roaring Furnace, Steaming Sauna, and then Chandra's can double up these effects as well. You can bounce your opponent's board with Season of Weaving. So all kind of cool ways there. Brass's Tunnel Grinder can let you discover over time. You have the Kiora lines here, so kind of graveyard centric, but can just be beat down, kind of free value. Graveyard Hate, cheap bounce effects. You have Lithomantic Barrage as a cheap removal for like Oculus, Terror, like we mentioned. Just so the Gross Vacuum's one card per turn. Soul Guides when you got to nuke the whole graveyard at once. Negate is cheap counters for the non-creature spells. Cheap kind of removal. Pyroclasm, Brotherhood's a sweeper. Scorching Dragonfire is exile. Then you have Jace for like the mono-white domain matchups, kind of mill them out that way. Virtue can also copy the trigger of Jace, so it gives you kind of extra copies of that. And then it can double up the triggers of like Capricious and stuff. It can double up Chandra's ability as well. Gruul Delirium. So the deck I played at the RCQ, not quite this list. This one's at 64%. Personally, I'm not a fan right now of Ren. I know people are playing it, but the way I see it, it's not great into mono red. Against all these bounce decks, the hexproof doesn't matter. Nowhere to Run kills your land. So that's just my opinion on it. I also didn't love Inti in the version just because you're often hellbent and you're kind of restricted on mana. So the exile doesn't really work. The trample could be relevant. I found it kind of mid on its own. But the core of the deck is you're trying to put cards into your graveyard to establish Delirium. You have a bunch of cards that are multiple types. Fear of Missing Out, Wildfowl Wickerfolk, Patchwork Beastie. And then you have kind of an Embercleave at home. Violent Urge gives a creature double strike and a power boost. Something like Wildfire Wickerfolk can deal with, basically be a 5-power double striker to kill out of nowhere. Keen-Eyed Curator, where if you exile Delirium under it, it becomes 7 power with trample, double strike it. So that's how I usually steal wins. Breakout's a nice way to cheat out hasty things like Fear of Missing Out that potentially can get you extra combats. It's also another way to get a sorcery into the graveyard. Things like Royal Treatment is being played in this deck over Snakeskin Veil because you're not playing Monstrous Rage. So the token's actually a little bit better. Now, the thing is, Ward and the hexproof for the turn doesn't really matter in terms of nowhere to run. There is sometimes I was using it to just scale up my creature. So if it was 3 toughness, just getting it to 4, so it could kind of still survive in that case. I do have a full sideboard guide on my version of the deck. If you check my playlist, there's a full 15-minute, I go over all the matchups and how to kind of apply it. Royal Treatment for more protection, cheap removal options, Paw Patch for enchantments. The mono white matchups, very, very hard. Fireclasm for the aggressive matchups. So I wasn't playing Untimely, but Untimely can be used to kind of redirect single targets or just get rid of big blockers to kind of against Domain and stuff like that to push through damage. Forge against the aggressive decks, and then Vengeful Possession to steal the big things. Sorry, against the controlling decks, not the aggressive decks. The thing is with this deck, so if your opponent shows Rest in Peace, take out Patchwork Beastie. This card doesn't do anything in terms of Rest in Peace. So keep that in mind. It needs Delirium to do anything. Similarly, if your opponent's showing a lot of copies of Authority of the Console, do not play Urbrass Forge. Urbrass Forge just reads every turn your opponent gains a life. So just kind of keep that in mind. Selesnya counters 62%. So Doomwake was playing this deck quite a bit. He ended up winning an RCQ with a Bant version, just blue lands in the mana base, so he could play some counters in the sideboard. I was having a hard time with control decks, or specifically Sunfall decks that kept beating the deck, but this deck's looking to get a lot of creatures that can kind of 2-for-1 value. So Elvish, Llanowar Elves helps you ramp ahead, but Sandstorm Salvager makes you multiple bodies, Sanguine, Toby, Paw Patch all make you multiple bodies. You have Collector's Cage then, when you have 3 creatures with varied power. You could cheat something into play from the Hideaway. Ideally be something like Overlord of the Mistmoors, but you can do cheeky stuff like Instant Speed, Sheltered by Ghosts to kind of blow them out. Against the Pixie decks, you have access to Wiltleaf Liege, 2 in the main, 2 in the side. If your opponent forces you to discard, well, you get that in for free, the old Locks It On Smiter. I guess this was one of the first ones, Wiltleaf against the Liliana decks when it first came out. And then you have Restless Prairie in this deck, plays really nicely with such a go-wide strategy. Elspeth Smite for cheap removal, Destroy Evil, again, enchantments or bigger creatures. You have things like Invasion, Aven Interrupter as ways to eat away at your opponent's hand, specifically the Sunfall decks, Rest in Peace for Graveyard Hate, Sheltered by Ghosts for the aggressive red-based matchups, Split Up again is just cheap sweepers. For the aggressive matchups, your opponent attacks in or holds back, you can kind of play around with the modes, and then Thrun for Dimir heavy counterspell based decks. Dimir Rats. Yes, folks. I cannot, like, there's 110 games played, 56% win rate. The Dimir cards are so good, you just throw together a bunch of removal and rats, and it kicks your ass. I will say, I lost the standard store champs to this card here. I was playing Heartfire Hero, and Ren the Relentless, Kalidas rat mode. If creature would die, it gets exiled instead. Goodbye Heartfire Hero, no death trigger. Beginning your end step, create X 1/1 rats, where this creature gets +1/1 for each other rat you control, where X is the number of creatures your opponent controlled that were exiled this turn. Every time they kill something, they get a rat, pretty much, at end step, which was just a pain in the ass. Killed me that way there. Charonix, the Rat King, toxic, other rats get toxic. It's card advantage for your rats. Skitter eats the graveyard, makes you rats. Patchwork ramps you and gives you an Anthem. Persistent Marsh Stalker, 2 mana, 3/1, +1/0 for each other rat. And then if you have Threshold, 7 or more cards, whenever you attack with 1 or more rats, you can pay 3 and then return it back to the battlefield tapped and attacking. Actually a nice one if your opponent's forcing you to discard. Nowhere to run, you go for the throw, cut downs. Azure Beast Binder can kind of tap down your opponent's stuff and remove their abilities. Nashi, I never remember what this card does. Menace, deals combat damage. You mill that many cards. You may put any number of legendary or enchantment cards from among them into your hand. If no cards are put in the hand, put a 1/1 counter on Nashi. Kind of interesting. Gix Command could be flexible, kind of sweeper, or pump your stuff and then Virtue as removal. You got a rat land here. You also have access to Lilypad Village, lets you surveil, and then the Mudflap can rebuy you stuff. I think the Mudflap's probably more useful. Varied removal options in the sideboard. Withering Torment, flexible to hit enchantments, blot out for big stuff. Negates in here for like sweepers, same with the Disdainful Stroke, some hand hate. It's just very discard, and then cheap removal for the red base decks. We then go to Dimir Bounce, 55%. Yes, Dimir Rats has got a higher win rate than Dimir Midrange, Dimir Bounce. This deck's another frustrating one to kind of play sometimes, never run out of deck. So Curiosity, Kaido, this town, you have the Storm Chaser's Talent package. Just a little bit more removal, Flood Pits, and Fear of Isolation. So a little bit more consistent, the mana base wise. Play more Soulstone. Just kind of control the deck that way. Gix Command is a sweeper for the go wide decks. Shelly again, like we kind of mentioned a lot of these with the other Dimir decks, but triggered activated abilities, mid-range to aggro matchups, you bring in Preacher, negate, cheap counter for like sweepers, big mana decks, get out. Really good in kind of these creature mirrors, the pixie mirror, stuff like that, because you can also rebuy your own stuff. The rest is cheap hand hate, cut down for the more aggressive. And then lastly, mono red aggro. So kind of stock list, like I said, has kind of fallen off in lieu of the green spells just because they're a little bit more flexible. Pretty much stock list here. Sideboard, you got Sunspine Links for the aggressive deck, or like the pixie decks. Anything with these greedy mana bases, the Oculus decks, stuff like that. Kind of hit them that way there. Against Domain, it gives you another way to potentially... they play a lot of basics in Domain, but it's a way to kind of stop the life gain. Forge for heavy removal, bolts, torches, kind of mixed into there. Scorching Shot may be something you want to consider as a mix in here, because this deck doesn't really have a clean... You have some Witchstalker Frenzies, I guess, in the main, so you're probably okay in that regard then. To Shieldred, but Barrage for like the bigger Oculus-style decks. Graveyard Hate with Ghost Vacuum. That is it for the week. Let me know what you think, what you've been playing, what you like. And make sure, in terms of likes, like this video, comment to help support, and we will catch you next time.